All right. Thanks, Rachel, and lovely to meet everyone here. And yeah, I'm excited to talk about forensic virtual labs today. So I think I became interested in this particular research during my PG CAP course, the postgraduate certificate in academic practice, and it was during the COVID time, during the lockdown period. And I think at the time we had to develop a lot of resources to support students learning remotely. And I thought of how such resources could be valuable to our students when we resume in-person learning. And I had two fantastic project students who helped me out with this project, taking the videos and so forth, who are my co-authors on this particular paper. So I'm hoping that I will be able to highlight some of the challenges in teaching forensic practical techniques, specifically, then talk a little bit about some of the pedagogical research on the use of virtual lab demonstrations in teaching science courses. And then thirdly, talk about specifically about the research that we did in this particular project, developing the forensic virtual lab demonstrations and highlights the value and students' views on these resources. And then lastly, I'll spend the rest of the time talking about the impact of these resources on students' knowledge, their independence in the laboratory, and also how these resources can build students' confidence in the lab environment to help them carry out forensic practical techniques more efficiently. Okay, so the first thing that I'll highlight here is just a couple of texts from our research that I have put on this slide just to capture some of the challenges that students face working in the laboratory. And the traditional laboratory instruction model that we use, which I believe is similar in your institutions as well. And first of all, we typically provide a lab script or manual to students. We also have a lecture to cover the theory underpinning the practical technique that we'll cover in the session. So these are pretty standard things that we do in the traditional lab instruction model. Sometimes we may demonstrate a particular technique in the laboratory to sort of demonstrate how students can carry out that specific activity, for example. And some of the challenges highlighted by students who participated in this research, one of them mentioned that I feel like I don't know what I'm doing. You don't really feel like you know what they are talking about, referring to sort of giving a briefing of what the lab session would cover. Another student also commented that I wouldn't say I was completely prepared because when you get into the lab, it's a completely different experience and a completely different environment. So these comments show that students sometimes get to the lab not feeling quite confident about what they will be doing. And obviously, this will impact their experience and engagement about the science or understanding of the practical technique that we cover in the lab session. So, how can we address these issues? How can we improve our support system, and how can we use virtual lab resources to support students in engaging and feeling more confident in the laboratory? So, the next thing I'll talk about is a couple of things about the pedagogical literature that underpin this research. And one of the authors in this particular area, Schumann, Huber, and Morial, describe what they call distinctive signature pedagogies, and it covers three specific areas of uh, professional work: how to think, how to perform, and how to act with integrity. And I like to think of forensic science. We have a way to think is the probabilistic interpretation, evaluation, and presentation of scientific evidence. Of course, not all forensic disciplines have this framework, but that is the promoted one in the discipline. In terms of how to perform, we have specific standards, ISO standards, which are described by the forensic science regulator in terms of identification, recovery, examination, analysis of evidence, interpretation, and evaluation. And in terms of how to act with integrity, we have to act with objectivity, irrespective of which party has employed a scientist. You have to be objective because your overriding duty is to the court, for example. And some of the processes we use to achieve this is maintaining the chain of custody of evidence and contemporaneous note taking. So, in practice, the way we capture these professional areas in teaching is the use of problem based, case based, and project based learning. So, problem based in the sense that we have a mock problem or case scenario that students are supposed to investigate. For example, in case based learning, students adapt the role of a forensic scientist or a crime scene investigator or a reporting scientist, and they perform those specific roles in examining a crime scene, carrying out analysis, interpreting results, and presenting their findings in court. Project-based learning tends to take the form of inquiry-based approaches like the final year project that students undertake, for example. So a number of research have actually been done on how virtual lab resources could be relevant in teaching science, different science courses, for example. And I've taken two key examples that we talked about in our paper just to highlight the benefits that they can offer our students in terms of improving their understanding, how to think, how to perform, to define standards, and also how to act with integrity, for example. All right, so the first piece of research, which was now done quite a long time ago now, was by Madarelli et al. And they evaluated virtual lab demonstration resources on an undergraduate biology program. So they used a couple of basic biology and advanced biology practicals, for example, micropipetting, centrifugation, and agarose gel preparation and electrophoresis. And in their research, what they did find was that these lab resources can improve students' knowledge. It can also improve their confidence and their experience in the laboratory. And an interesting aspect of this particular research was looking at a comparison of using just virtual lab resources versus face-to-face lab sessions versus a combination of virtual lab resources and face-to-face practicals, for example. And here I have picked up some of the graphs of the results, the findings from this particular paper. And what you can note in here is, that, so the graph shows students rating in terms of their knowledge, experience, and confidence before and after watching the virtual lab demonstrations. So the darker colors that you see, the darker colors represent ratings before watching the videos, and the lighter colors represent the ratings after watching the videos. And this shows sort of students' ratings for video demonstrations of agarose gel preparation. And what we can see from these findings is that prior to watching the videos, a majority of students rated their knowledge, their experience, and confidence to be very low. So we can see here that majority of students rated their knowledge very low, their confidence very low as well, and their experience very low prior to watching the virtual lab demonstrations. And what the authors observed was a shift or an improvement in the ratings of students after watching the videos. So after watching the videos, for example, here we see that quite a higher proportion of students reported an improvement in their knowledge versus prior to watching the video, for example. And these findings have been confirmed in other research as well, like Croker et al. And Croker et al. Looked at the value of virtual lab demonstrations of human physiology practicals on a second year undergraduate program. And here, some of the labs that they looked at was measurement of blood pressure, for example, measurement of lung function, and so on. And again, confirming the findings from previous research. Here, they observed that attendance to sessions had improved. And also, they observed that students were engaging in more meaningful interactions with the instructors in the laboratory. And also, they did realize that students commented that the virtual lab resources was a useful tool for revision as well. So typically, students will probably have just one opportunity to carry out a laboratory technique, and that's it. But with the availability of these virtual lab resources, students can always go back and revise the technique and also evaluate their performance in the laboratory as well. Okay, so that leads us to what we did specifically in our research. So we wanted to investigate how forensic science students can benefit from such virtual lab resources as well. And we focused on just very basic laboratory practicals that we sort of deliver at level 4 and 5 on our undergraduate program here at Northumbria University. So we carried out a demonstration of indirect presumptive test for blood using the LMG test, the direct presumptive test for blood as well, and the process of carrying out an examination of an exhibit for searching an exhibit for the presence of blood. So these demonstrations can be found as a supplementary material on the paper online. So you can probably watch them as well. And we use the Canon EOS M50 camera to capture the demonstrations. And we captured the demonstrations at different angles, and we use the Adobe Premiere Pro to edit the videos. And we added some subtitles to them as well. We then uploaded the videos on Penapto, which I'm sure probably many of you have used it. And Penapto allows us to embed some quizzes as well as a form of knowledge check. So for example, in the LMG test, we asked a question about the order of adding the reagents, the chemicals, for example, just to check students' understanding of the practical, for example. Okay, so that then leads me to the questionnaire. So what we were really interested in this particular research was the depth of understanding in terms of the students' opinions and views about the value of these lab resources. And although we have over 400 students enrolled on our program, we were more interested in an in-depth view or attitudes of students towards the use of these virtual lab resources rather than the breadth of understanding where a survey, for example, may be more appropriate. So we administered a semi-structured questionnaire to 7 undergraduate students who enrolled on the program. And the interview questions that we asked covered 3 main themes. So one is their experience working in the laboratory. So for example, whether they feel prepared coming into the lab, whether they're able to engage in meaningful conversations about the science and the theory behind the practicals or not, for example, and how confident they feel. And then we moved on to ask them general questions about the opinions about virtual lab modules. So some of the students who had enrolled on the project had already used these resources during the COVID era, for example. So they had some form of idea about these virtual lab resources. So prior to watching the videos that we had developed, we asked them questions about their general views about virtual lab demonstrations. Then after those set of questions, we then provided the videos that we had developed. The students watched them, and then we asked them a series of questions about their perspectives on the specific video demonstrations that we produced on blood examinations. So the interviews took roughly about 20 to 30 minutes each, and we then uploaded the audio files on one specific transcription online software, author.ai, and this transcribed the data for us, and we have to check them, and we use the thematic analysis approach to identify key themes in the transcript or based on the responses of the students. So here I have provided a bit of description of the characteristics of the study participants that we had. So as I said, we had 7 students who enrolled on the project. One of them was a second-year student with English as their first language. And here I would caveat that at the onset of the project, we were not really interested in whether language impacted on students' views on the videos or not. But we realized that in the analysis of the data, this became an important factor to consider in understanding and conceptualizing the responses that students had provided. So the participant 3 was a second-year student. English is not their first language, and the 5 other students were third-year students. Again, English was not their first language as well. And again, when I talk about the data that we had, probably that'll provide a bit of context about why this became important in the research. Okay, so we identified 3 key themes in the transcripts that we analyzed. And the first major one was that all students agreed that these virtual lab resources, virtual lab resources can improve their confidence in the laboratory. It can also improve their autonomy in terms of the level of assistance and support that they may need working in the laboratory. And these virtual lab resources can also enhance the understanding and knowledge of the practical concepts that we cover in the laboratory. Another sub-theme or 2 other sub-themes that we also noted from the transcript was that students thought these virtual lab resources can decrease the levels of uncertainty that they feel going into the laboratory and its associated anxiety and stress that they have. So these resources can decrease that uncertainty and they become more familiar with the lab environment and the procedure that they have to carry out, and therefore it will improve their confidence. And the last key sub-theme was about inclusive learning. Again, going back to the language barrier that I mentioned, these virtual lab resources, in essence, can be a visual representation of the lab script or the manual that they have to use in the laboratory. And students who have where English is not their first language, this resource can be very useful in terms of understanding what they have to do and how to perform to expected standards as a forensic scientist in the laboratory. So I'll spend the next couple of slides, I'll highlight some of the extracts from the responses that students gave in respect to these specific themes. Okay, so the very first one, which was improving students' confidence, their independence and knowledge. And really, the above findings really are consistent with previous studies, like I mentioned in the introductory slides by Madanrelli and Croker and Campbell and so forth, about how these virtual lab resources can improve students' confidence and their autonomy and their understanding of the concepts being covered. And these comments that I have on the slide highlight some of these. And one student mentioned that I feel like everyone could understand the resource that we had provided. Another student mentioned that it gave me actually more information than if I read some or like academic sources on this, for example. So that visual representation of the lab script or the procedure that they have to carry out can help students to quickly understand what they have to do and what is expected of them in the lab. Another student commented that I feel like now I know that you have to do it on the side of the filter paper you actually touch the blood with rather than and saying that I go off of what you did. So one of the common mistakes we do see in the laboratory that students make is that although the lab script specifies which side of the filter paper that you have to add, either due to anxiety, for example, or some form of pressure in the laboratory, some students will skip this step, for example, or will make some mistakes or will be asking very trivial questions rather than understanding the principle behind the test itself. So providing these virtual resources can help students be more familiar with the procedure and what to do as well in the lab. Another student mentioned that this would help to not be so stressed about who I'm going to be paired up with to know actually what to do. I would definitely be more confident in what to do. So we see that these virtual lab resources can support our students to be more familiar about the lab environment and also the procedure that they have to carry out. And this will enable students to engage in a critical discussion of the techniques rather than troubleshooting or asking very trivial questions, for example. So the next key theme, which was about uncertainty, again linked to building students' confidence in the laboratory. And some of the common mistakes, as I said, we see students make can be trivial questions they ask, or it can be really basic mistakes, often due to stress in the laboratory. And as I said, like the LMG test that they have to carry out, some students, for example, will add the hydrogen peroxide before adding the LMG reagent, for example, rather than the other way around, or will be thinking a lot about what to do in the laboratory. But once they're exposed to these virtual lab resources, they will be familiar with what they are supposed to do or expected to do in the laboratory. So familiarization with the lab environment and what actions to perform can minimize the uncertainty related anxieties in the lab. And watching an expert carry out the activity can build students' confidence in the laboratory and minimize the time spent on troubleshooting or worrying about what to do, for example. So these comments that I have on the slides highlight these factors. So one student commenting on the value of the virtual lab resource said, I'd feel pretty confident because you show me exactly what to do, like someone else is doing it, rather than just being told what to do. Another student mentioned, you know what to expect when you go to the lab, maybe gives you less anxiety, frustration. Another student mentioned that I feel like if I watched that, like before going to a lab, I wouldn't need as much assistance as I do now. And again, when we in our paper we discuss the fact that to what extent should we minimize uncertainty in the learning environment, because we know, especially in inquiry-based experiments, it's important that that level of uncertainty is there for students to discover things on their own, for example. So I think it's more about ensuring that balance. And for some basic practical techniques, these resources can be provided to students. Then the other theme that I also want to mention is about addressing inclusive learning. And this was probably one of the interesting findings from our study and highlights the struggles that international students could face, for example, on our programs. Now, laboratory instructions are typically standardized for all students, and obviously the language of instruction is English. At our university, we provide our students with an academic language skills module to support students who are non-native speakers. However, the responses from our students highlighted the fact that a visual representation of the lab script and manual, such as virtual lab demonstrations or resources, could enhance the experience of non-native English speakers. And one of the students on the project mentioned that, for example, in first year, I think that would be much more helpful because I didn't understand with my English 100% of what was happening. Another student also commenting similarly mentioned that sometimes things are not written down easy enough for everyone to understand. So, like the instructions you need to follow, sometimes they are more, I don't know, scientific and more professional. So, seeing the video before, it will just save you time of trying to figure out why am I reading here? What do I need to do? Yeah. So these comments highlight the usefulness of these virtual lab resources, especially since we have a multinational cohort on our programs, and our programs also attract quite a huge number of international students as well. So that leads me then to the sort of ultimate question. Can virtual lab resources replace face-to-face labs? Obviously, no. And the comments by our students highlight this point. One student mentioned that you need the experience. You need actually to go in and do it and practice yourself so that they can build the hands-on skills that they need as forensic scientists. However, the usefulness of these virtual lab resources are evident. They can support students' understanding of practical concepts and how to perform to define standards within the forensic science sector. Also, in cases where we have, like we had the pandemic and lockdown period, where students have to learn remotely, they can ensure the continuity of learning. And I really like this comment by one of the participants said, but I know that when we did a module last year with the virtual lab, like I still understood it. And I was like, I use what I learned last year online now in that actual lab. So I feel like I wouldn't say that replace them, but they could be, in times like COVID and stuff like it, it did work. It was like, it wasn't like it was useless because it did work and it did help. So we can clearly see the value of these resources where there's severe disruption to learning as well. So just to conclude, and some implications and thoughts really is about the fact that one, these lab resources are not aimed at replacing face-to-face lab sessions because as a forensic scientist, you need to practice. You must gain the hands-on skills and experience. But clearly, the availability of these resources can support our students to ensure continuity of learning during pandemics and where there are severe disruption of in-person learning, or where students need some form of reasonable adjustment where they cannot be on campus, for example. They can also support students in preparing for face-to-face sessions. And as I mentioned earlier, usually students have only one opportunity in the lab, but once they have these resources, they can revisit it several times and can help them in their revision as well. They can support technicians and staff in preparing for sessions as well and designing a flipped classroom model as well. Obviously, the available research demonstrates that these resources can enhance students' mastery of laboratory techniques. And we obviously need to design research to validate the forensic virtual lab resources so that we can enhance the students' experience. What we aim to look at now is how these resources can influence students' performance, for example. And obviously, working with industry partners and collaboration, we can improve this and develop 3D virtual lab simulations where students can carry out experiments using the traditional lab instruction modules, expository, discovery, and query-based or problem-based, for example, and also look at the correlation between these resources and the performance of students. So I'll be happy for any ideas on collaboration on this project as well. So thank you for listening, and I'll hopefully take any questions afterwards. So thanks.